Hello and welcome. I'm Jacquelyn Sundberg, and I work with the ROAAR group here at the McGill Library. That stands for the Rare Books and Special Collections, the Osler Library of the History of Medicine, Visual Arts Collections, and the Archives and Records Management Group. The ROAAR Book Club that you're attending today is not your average book club. We don't all read the same material and discuss it at the session. Instead, we connect over a shared interest in ideas as diverse and eclectic as our collections. So it's really a pleasure today to welcome print artist George Walker and to have a peek inside our book arts laboratory. Before we go further, I do want to acknowledge that McGill University, and particularly its downtown campus where I and our other speakers are located today, has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst nations and amongst Indigenous peoples, including the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe nations. ROAAR honors, recognizes, and respects these nations as the traditional stewards of the lands and waters on which we meet today. Now I'll let Jennifer Garland, Assistant Head of Rare Books and Special Collections, introduce our speakers.
Thanks, Jacquelyn. It's my pleasure to introduce George Walker. George is a wood engraver, a book artist, an author, and an educator who's been teaching since the 1980s. I was first introduced to his work through the McGill collection several years ago and have had the chance to see him in action on several occasions. Most recently, I've spent the past 2 days working with him here on site in our book arts lab. I have to say it's the most fun I've had at the library in some time. George is based in Toronto, where he teaches letterpress, bookbinding, and wood engraving at OCAD University, the Ontario College of Art. George Walker exhibits his wood engravings and his limited edition books internationally, and we have more than 20 editions of his works here in the McGill Library. Tonight, you will be introduced to several of these works, as George Walker is joined in conversation by my colleague, Anne-Marie Holland, the curator of the Colgate History of Printing collection and a founding member of the McGill Book Arts Lab. You're really in for a treat. Now, before we join the conversation, we'll watch a short 15-minute video of George Walker printing a wood engraving of Leonard Cohen on our 200-year-old Columbian printing press.
There were many innovations during the Industrial Revolution where they invented machines that may take a shorter piece of type, and especially some of the rotary machines that you would have to load the type into. The advantages of these machines were speed, and that's one of the advantages of this beautiful Columbian press, is that it was reported that a man could pull as many as 250 impressions an hour. Of course, they don't take into consideration all the time that it took in order to set the press up to print 250 an hour. And even today, set up on any printing press takes the majority of time. Once the machine is set up, then with an assistant, feeding paper into the machine is not a big issue, and it goes quite quickly. So a press like this, another advantage of the iron press over the wooden press, was an impression could be had with a single stroke of the lever. So here we have the sconce here that drives the winch in, and the whole bed underneath the platen. And this particular model uses a unique design of levers and inclined planes to produce the weight, the pressure that is needed in order to make an impression out of a large form. Now, the claim was that the Columbian press could actually print a royal sheet. A royal sheet was about this size. This is 18 by 24, and I think it was about 19 by 25 was a royal sheet. So something this big, you can imagine in one stroke on the press. What a great boon for the printer to be able in a single stroke finish a whole form. And this meant that newspapers loved this idea. They thought, oh, this is great. No one, the printer wouldn't have to be doing 2 impressions, because in the wooden presses, you had to do 1 stroke, pull the form in a little farther, and then do another stroke. And so that took time, right? So time is money, and especially, and also for the newspapers, it was really important to get things out on time. And of course, this wonderful piece of machinery is one of the most important communication tools of the 19th century. And you can see that George Clymer, who invented this particular model, has made reference to that. Here he has the wings and the sneaks on the rod here of Hermes, which the Romans called Mercury. And so there's a reference to that, the messenger of the gods. And we have the eagle. And in Europe, this press was often referred to as an eagle press. But it's actually Columbian. And of course, these wonderful dolphins here. So a very unique looking machine, not at all like the wooden presses that were available at the time. And Ramage, who was providing wooden presses in the United States at the time that Clymer was selling these presses, his presses were like $150, where a press like this, which was very expensive at the time, was about between $350 to $500. And so it's no wonder that Clymer had to move his whole business out of the United States and to England to manufacture these presses where there was more of a market, where you didn't have people moving around as much. In the United States, of course, you had people wanting to move around. There were a lot of small towns turning up, and presses had to be disassembled and moved quickly. And this press is actually made to be disassembled, but it was very, very heavy. And you can imagine throwing something like this, which is around 2 tons, onto a wagon being pulled by some horses. And if a part broke in transportation, you probably wouldn't be able to find anybody to repair it. Why? Because you might find a blacksmith, but where are you going to find a machinist who can cut threads and do a bit of precision work so that you can get your machine up and running? A ding on the bed, rust, all these things are the enemies of a fine press. And so we're always worried about these things, the enemies of the press, which are often just the natural elements taking their toll. And because of those things, this press didn't become popular in the United States, and so only very few of these models were actually sold in the United States. I think only about 20. Great, so we have our form locked up in a cast iron chase here. This chase is from a CMP press, but we put it on here to give you an example of how a lockup is done on a platen press. And you see here I have a wood engraving that I've locked up in here, and a type that I've hand set. And surrounding the type are pieces of furniture that are these large pieces here. You can see that this one is 10 picas wide and 50 picas long. And these devices here are called coins, and the coins expand, and these are in a shell, and these are very, very modern. In the old presses, like the English Common Press and earlier, and even Gutenberg Press, they used wedges like this and these wedges would lock up the form. These ones here have these wedges inside of this shell here, and we use a key to open and close them. And just let me get my key, and I can show you that. And so what I'm looking for is to make sure that my form is locked up. And so here's the key. You can see that this expands as you move it out like this. You can see this gets larger, and that creates the pressure to hold the form in place. And you want the form tight enough that it doesn't move, but not too tight that the form rises. So getting the tension right on the form is really important to get a good impression from that. Other things that we use to lock up are these little pieces of wood here, which are called reglets. And the reglets go into a special reglet case, and they are all in standardized points and picas. So we have reglets, we have leading that we usually use in between the type, and we have furniture that surrounds it, and this whole thing is known as the form, and we call this a locked up form. Okay, and another problem, of course, is that when you're setting type, before you lock it up, you should actually take a block of wood like this. This is called a plane, and you need to tap your type to make sure that you don't have any letters sticking up that might cause a problem when you start to print. Another thing that we like to look at is the height of type, and sometimes if you try to match your type, you'll find that some pieces of type are higher than other pieces of type, and this is what a type high gauge is for. This is a challenge type high gauge, and you can see here that this space in here is set for the North American type high, which is 0.918. Here's a piece of wood type. And we can see that when I put this in there, that, oh, this is just slightly higher than type high. See these lines that are on the gauge? They tell me that that's the ideal location. So why is this piece of wood type just slightly higher than type high? It's because it will need a little bit more pressure because there's a larger area to print in order to get a solid color on here. So the type for the wood type is usually just slightly higher than a piece of lead type. Here's a piece of lead type, and let's put it in here. We can see that it fits right into 0.918, which is the ideal for printing on this press. Excellent. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to ink up our form on the press. And I've selected 2 inks for this because I'm going to ink each area differently. So the type I'm going to ink one way, and the block I'm going to ink another way. And the reason is because they each require a different amount of ink. I've decided that I also want the block to have a richer black and a deeper black. And so I've chosen this Charbonnel ink, the Noir Vignette, and it's an oilier ink, and it dries by oxidization, whereas the ink I'm going to use for the type is a rubber-based ink, and it dries by absorption into the paper. So they dry differently. This ink will stay open longer on the palette as well as on the press, and only starts to dry when it is absorbed into the paper. This ink will dry by oxidization, so as it is exposed to oxygen, it slowly starts drying. And I've put a piece of wax paper on here in order to protect the ink. When we're removing ink from the can, it's important not to dig a hole, especially with inks that oxidize. We don't want to dig a hole into the can and then have the ink oxidize and from the middle and then out to the side. So we always just skim a bit of ink off of the surface like so. This ink I'm using for the block, so I'm going to put it out here, and I'm using the smaller speedball roller with a urethane rubber, and I prefer the rollers with the metal cores because I find them more stable than cores that are plastic or the ones where the roller pops off. I find them frustrating to work with. I'm not only looking at the ink, I'm listening to it. And so that tells me what kind of coverage I have. And on printing presses, many pressmen also listen to the ink to know that they have the right amount of ink on the press. Now this one, I don't have to worry about the ink skinning in the can. So there's no skin on this, and so I can take out the ink carefully from the surface, and then I'm going to run it along here like so. That'll give me my ink well, and then I have this lovely roller that's been covered with urethane rubber, and it has a durometer, which is the amount of give that the rubber has, of about 25, which is what I prefer for letterpress printing. So I'm going to then roll this out, and notice I don't just go back and forth like this. the proper way to get the ink even out on your palette is to lift it and let the roller spin so that it goes into a new position every time. So it's not just back and forth, and you can even turn the roller around to try to even out the ink. So I'm trying to get a very thin ink, and I want it to be very tight. And by tight I mean that it's thin and I can hear the tack, but that has a very different sound than this. And this is the sound I want for this one. So I'm going to now take this and use it on the press. Great, it's time for an impression. That's what we try to make here when we ink up a form. And I've got the ink tightly rolled out on this roller here, and I'm looking to make sure I don't have any little pieces of dried ink, because that's always irritating if you get a chunk of dried ink on your form and you go to print and you'll get something known as an ink hickey. Why do they call it ink hickey? Because it's usually a dark dot with a halo around it, and they're very irritating if you have a whole form full of ink hickeys. So we try to avoid ink hickeys when we can. I've got some bearing strips on here. So bearing strips are type high pieces of lead that I put on either side of my lockup here. I've got a wood engraving and some type. And what I'm going to do is, in my first pass, I'm just going to go over both the wood block and the type. And I'm going to go over a couple of times like that. The role of these bearing strips is to prevent my roller from wobbling. So as I go over the form, the roller might do this, and I might ink up areas that I don't want to get ink on. And so this prevents that from happening. I'm just going to charge this roller again. So that's just adding some more ink on it. So one thing that you have to remember is that applying the ink is a bit of an art. If you go quickly across it, back and forth, the back stroke, if it's very, very quick, actually removes ink from the surface. And so you're defeating the purpose of what you're trying to do. So we want to go single strokes in one direction like so. And that way I can look at this and I can say, yes, I think that has a lovely film of ink on it. So that's the first inking I'm doing. Now this particular one is a bit special because I'm going to add more ink to the wood engraving, because I want that to be a little bit more over inked than the type. And so I've added some there. Now we're going to, thank you, Lauren has actually added my piece of paper, I think, on here. We're ready to go. So we're going to flip the frisket, our press assistant, and we're going to then put this down, and so then the paper hopefully will align where we want it. It's quite likely, because this is the first impression, that it won't be perfect. But we strive for perfection, but once we get the press set up, we'll be able to rapidly pull off impressions from this. So we take the sconce, we pull the form under the platen all the way, and okay, we've got the platen under the form underneath the platen here, and I've put it in all the way, and now I'm going to stretch to pull the lever and make my impression. So I can feel that. That's not bad. The levers make it easy to pull. Now I'm going to pull it out. Now normally, if this was a English common press, I would also do a pull here so that I get even pressure across the whole form. Now we hold our frisket and pull the whole thing up and see what we got. There we go, pull that off. So now we pulled an impression off, and you can see that it's a little bit off center. We want to either move the form or our registration over a little bit to create an even space between those two things. What do you think? We've got
the impression looks really nice.
It's not bad at all. A little bit over inked on the type. We might want to use a little bit less. But overall, what I like about this is I've got a nice rich black happening in the background, and my fine white lines are holding up. And so overall, not too bad. Now, one of the things we did do to this paper that you should know is we dampened it. And the idea of dampening the paper, it actually dissolves some of the sizing in the paper. You might ask, well, what is this sizing, George? The sizing is the starch that holds the cellulose fibers together. And when we dampen the paper, that relaxes the sizing, and so the fibers are more receptive to the ink. And so this was a common thing that was done when printing with rag papers. And this is 100% rag paper. This is not newsprint. This is not a pulp paper. And so dampening it, we're not going to see the same type of damage as if you took a piece of newsprint and dampened it, or a piece of commercial paper. Many commercial papers that are done on commercial paper making machines, when they get dampened, they immediately curl in the direction of the grain, and then it's almost impossible to print them. So that, in those cases, if I'm using a commercial paper, I will probably print it dry. You know, because every time you open a book and you see all this marvelous printing from a day gone past, you get to time travel, which may or may not be possible. But you certainly can time travel in books. I always tell my students that that's the wonderful thing about books, is that you get to hear voices that are no longer with us.
So that's George in action in our book arts laboratory. Now we're going live to our Colgate room, where George and Anne-Marie are discussing some of his editions that we have here in the collections, and some he's brought with him.
So we have Leonard Cohen, Conrad Black, Tom Thompson here in our collections. But for the Pickford, you pulled 2 original prints off of the Columbian press when it was in the shop of Nick Howard Ironworks in Oakville, Ontario. And we should mention here that thanks to an insertion of funds from the Dean of Libraries, Colleen Cook, this massive iron hand press, which you've all been able to just notice, has been completely restored. And George Walker was the first to use our Columbian, not even in Montreal, but in Ontario, following a period of some 50 years of it being in disrepair. So we're just delighted. Thank you again. We noticed that you use a Vandercook SP15, for instance. Tell us about your Pickford book, your clamshell boxes, which are gorgeous. And do tell us why artists feel compelled to use obsolete machinery to express their ideas and vision on occasion.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. They're great questions. And I just want to first start by saying that how Nick did such an amazing job restoring that press. It is so beautifully done, and it's a joy to print on. And I was very happy to be the first person to use it. I was very excited to do that, as any print aficionado may be who is familiar with this type of equipment. And to talk about my Mary Pickford book, which I pulled one of the first proofs on that press in Ontario. It's a book about the life and times of Mary Pickford, who of course was a silent film star. And I thought, wouldn't it be fun to make a book which is pretending to be a silent film? And I made 87 wood engravings with intertitles telling the life and times of Mary Pickford. And this book is bound in Japanese sahi silk, and in each,
it's gorgeous to the touch. We have had a chance to have some tactile experience with your works, and we just we love that aspect of them.
Thank you. And the other fun feature of this is that I've created a drawer in the binding itself, and it has ephemera from the time of Mary Pickford. So things like silver spoons with Mary Pickford's name on it that was available when she was alive, and postcards that people would have sent in the time period. And I also included in this particular box is a film cell from a Charlie Chaplin film, which is actually nitrate film, which is highly flammable, but I've protected it in this glass slide here. So it's an example of the early silent film cellulose. So this was a fun project to do, and it can take me 2 to 3 years to do a book, depending upon its complexity. And also there's a research involved trying to find out all the details of Mary Pickford's life so that I can successfully tell the story.
Understand. And your SP15 Vandercook?
Oh, yes. Yes. So it's
how-
a cylinder press. So it's
Okay.
not like the press here in the lab, the presses that they have in the lab, and they have some beautiful presses here. And I hear the rumor is that downstairs in storage they have a Stanhope and some other fabulous presses that one day with your help maybe they'll be able to bring them up from the basement and create even a larger lab where to tell the story of the presses. But my Vandercook, just to quickly mention, that machine is a cylinder press, and these presses are platen presses. The difference is just the type of printing and how the paper feeds through the machine.
Okay, wonderful.
Okay, thank you.
So we are currently sitting in the Colgate seminar room that I've mentioned. This is where a part of 14,000 items are stored in the William Colgate History of Printing collection. It is one of the best collections of its kind in Canada, and we wish to promote it. It covers all of the book arts, including book illustration, in private press limited editions, such as your work. So we're very proud to have your work. In fact, McGill Library houses about 25 books by George Walker in various editions, both limited, so private press, and in trade or popular editions. These books are located across our specialized branches and not just in rare books, which means that you are reaching a wide audience. Was that your intention, or could you tell us more about these polar, not opposites, but complements rather in book production?
Well, the cost of making one of these books is enormous. I spent a lot of time and money to create these limited edition books, and the editions are quite small. For instance, the Mary Pickford, there's only 35 copies. So to own a copy of this particular edition would cost you thousands of dollars. Whereas if I can convince a publisher that what I'm doing is can be successful, then a popular edition means my audience is much larger than the 20 or so people that might stumble across it in the rare book room.
Yes, absolutely. And we're so happy that perhaps somebody is going to stumble across your popular edition, come to the rare book room to look further at the limited edition. We would also like to mention your Alice books. They're fascinating. We just purchased one of your limited editions called Alice Through the Looking Glass with 94 wood engravings by you, published in 1998. It is bound in this bright red cloth with ornaments, chest ornaments on the front covers. It's just so charming. These Alice editions are a collaboration printed by Bill Poole of Poole Hall Press.
Yes.
Tell us more about this collaboration and perhaps that project in general.
Well, Bill Poole was my mentor at college. He was my professor who taught me everything I know about creating books from the ground up. And in the 1980s, he and Joseph Brabant invited me to start work on the first Canadian edition of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, meaning that it would be the first book printed in Canada and illustrated by a Canadian artist. And I was thrilled to be part of that. And the deal was, and this is a good deal, they would buy lunch as long as I did a wood block for every meeting. And so I wanted to last as long as possible. So you can imagine that's 98 lunches at least. And so that was pretty good for me. And at the time I was a student, and Bill introduced me to hand printing, and I learned bookbinding from people like Emerson Evans at the University of Toronto, the Fisher Rare Book Library. And I also got to meet Robertson Davies, because that was the first book I printed fully, was with in Bill Poole's class. We printed On Being a Professional, written by Robertson Davies. We went over to Massey College, we met Robertson Davies, we talked to him, and we produced this wonderful hand-printed book that was printed on a iron hand press, just like it was an Albion, just like some of the presses you can find here. And we hand set it in Kennerly old style type, and we asked Robertson Davies to give us a piece of his clothing and some tea leaves and other items that we beat to a pulp to make the paper for the book. So we made the book from scratch, starting with nothing and then making the paper, hand setting the type, and then printing the book and working out the imposition of the pages and binding the books all at the college back in the 80s.
What a wonderful story. Thank you for that. And we are in the midst of procuring, I hope, another Alice book. A is for Alice. From what I understand, your wife, Michelle Walker, produced some text for this book.
Yes.
I love that collaboration as well. Do you collaborate a lot together?
Well,
or-
yes, she's the second half of the team. These things can't be done in a vacuum. You need other people. That's the wonderful thing about hand making books, is that they're very, very collaborative adventures. And you collaborate with authors, you collaborate with editors, you collaborate with people that may have better equipment than you. And some of my bindings, after I do a few test bindings, like here's some examples of some of the test bindings I did for the Mary Pickford with my hand decorated papers. I would take these test bindings to my friend who has a bindery in St. Catharines, Ontario, and I would ask him, well, can you reproduce something like this for me? I need 50 copies of it. And he has larger equipment than I have, and he can do it a lot cheaper. But I need to work out all of these, the finer points and the details, like, do I want raised bands? So this is a quarter bound handmade paper covered boards with raised bands and beveled boards on this one. And this is bound full bound in Japanese Asahi silk. This is the binding that I went for in the end. And you can see that there's definitely a difference. I don't know if you can see it on your
In the
monitors
blues,
in
yes.
the colors, but these
Mhm.
are just the subtle changes.
Yes.
And my wife also helps me choosing the aesthetics for some of these additions too. So it's an important role, and it's always important to have the input of other people,
Yes.
and to be able to make sure that you don't print a spelling error, God forbid. And that's why we love to have
Print is forever, yes.
editors.
In fact, we love your instructive handbook on the art of woodblock illustration. McGill owns the second edition. Tell us about your instructive handbook projects.
The Woodcut Artist's Handbook is a bit of the history of wood engraving and woodcut, and I talk about different ways in which people can get involved in carving their own blocks. If that's an inspiration and a creative outlet for you, I think that it's important to pay these things forward, because even if you're not interested in doing it yourself, it's good to know how these things were done, so that when you're looking at woodcuts or illustrations or wood engravings done in books, that you understand how they're made. And it deepens the appreciation.
It's
I think.
excellent to have instruction from a practitioner, frankly. So thank you for that work. And one last question, Porcupine's Quill collaboration in the Inverted Line, published in 2000. You have a wonderful overview of your wood engravings there with references to technique and tools once again. So we do wish to reference this book. You mentioned a phrase about the future of the printed book. You say the book does remain at this time in 2000, the undisputed time capsule of knowledge, although the internet has recently become the equally undisputed superhighway of information retrieval. Pardon me.
That's
a
okay.
long sentence.
So I'm sorry.
So frankly, you are a professor at the Ontario College of Art and Design, University in Toronto. What are your thoughts today on the future of the book?
It's a good question, because what we really should be asking is, what is a book? It's something that that we are constantly trying to simulate in our new technologies. And this has been echoed in the works of Marshall McLuhan too, of how communication technologies transform the way that we understand information. But we also make simulations of previous technologies when new technologies supersede them. And by that, I mean that we talk about the book as being this paper tome that we know is an excellent archive and that can move through time successfully. We have books that are hundreds and hundreds of years old, and we can still access the information up in them. But we can't do that with a lot of electronic technology that we don't know that we can, because it hasn't been around long enough. And so the internet is an unproven archive. The digital world is an unproven archive, and paper knowledge and knowing things through the experience of paper is a proven vehicle for understanding things. And so for the future of the book, I see that the book will never disappear, but our ideas of simulating it in new technologies is not going to end. Hence the ebook, which creates simulations of what the book is, but it is not really the printed book. Really what you're looking at is electronic text, and electronic text is a separate technology. It's like when the car first came along, they were making horseless carriages, they called them. And the cars were rickety and they were better suited to be pulling by horses, whereas it took designers like Bel Geddes to realize that the car was really a rocket and it had to be redesigned for the speed that it could go. And the whole thing had to be rethought of. It's a different type of vehicle. And this is true of the internet and of internet technologies like ebooks, which can contain hyperlinks that take you out of the frame that the author has set up for you and link to information that may be outside of the frame of the subject that you're reading. And this disrupts the way that we process knowledge. And that's why paper knowledge is such an important part of understanding how information moves through time and through society and through our culture.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you for these thoughts. We're wondering whether our audience might have further questions for you, George Walker. We're just really so happy to have your works, first of all, here, that you represent Canadian private presses here in the William Colgate History of Printing collection. And we hope to keep up our collaboration in the future.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm happy to answer any questions we might have.
Thanks so much to both of you. We do have some questions from the crowd, and I encourage anyone who has some to put them in the chat, and I will voice them on your behalf to Anne-Marie and George. So first up, we have one from Chris Lyons, who you met earlier today, the head of ROAAR Books and Special Collections here, and a collector and an eternally curious person. And what he wanted to know was about the kind of wood that you used for the printing blocks that we saw in the video.
Yes. Thank you, Chris. That's a great question. I use Canadian maple for most of my illustrations because most of my work has a Canadian base in it. And so I'm really interested in that. And plus Canadian maple, I find a joy to carve on. I carve on the end grain of Canadian maple as opposed to the plank, where the end grain of the wood means that I don't get splinters when I go across the grain. And I'm using engraving tools, the tools of the silversmith, as opposed to the tools of the woodcutter, which are the parting tool and gouge. For one of my books, the Life and Times of Pierre Elliott Trudeau, it's called Pierre Elliott Trudeau, La Vie en Rose. And in that wordless narrative, the last engraving in it, I engraved on a piece of maple wood that I got from a few blocks over from where I live, is the historic home of Alexander Murr. And Alexander Murr wrote a song called The Maple Leaf Forever, which became a Canadian anthem. And I thought, wouldn't it be great if I did the last wood engraving in the Trudeau book on Canadian maple from that tree? So I set out to get myself a piece of that wood, which I did because the tree came down in a storm. Sadly, an end of a historical icon, but I preserved it in the book where all the impressions were taken off of that block that I was able to make from a piece of wood from that tree. Great question.
We have a guest in the crowd who you will know. Apparently we have one of our friends and the press restorer from Howard Ironworks with us today. So a big hello and thank you to that entire team for getting our press in working order a couple of years ago now. So thank you to them. Another question for you that comes in about film. You mentioned a little bit there. As film is having a resurgence in the digital age, you can talk to a lot of photographers, and this is really coming back for a lot of people. How do you view the usage of the old presses? Do you think they'll become more in demand in future art field and projects?
Yes, it's a good observation. What's happening is this sort of nostalgia cultural contagion where we start longing for the slow media, that things that are beginning to disappear. Think about the resurgence in interest in typewriters or vinyl or these communication technologies that seem to be disappearing, or they seem to be no longer as available as they once were, no longer as ubiquitous as they once were in our culture. And so there is a sense that something is missing, that there is something gained from the experience of communication media that seems to be going out of fashion. But that's why media like the radio will persist, is because it fills a space that we need. And I enjoy working on the old presses. I think that it is like artisanal cooking or making things by hand. It slows things down. It means you have more time to think about what you're doing. It is not about mass producing. It's about creating unique items. And that's why a lab like this is so important, so that students who want to venture into private press printing can discover the joys of making things one at a time, making unique objects that speak to their concerns. And so that if you want to share that with the world, it's actually very easy now, because we can just take pictures and post them on social media or on the internet, or create a web space for it. But creating unique items that have all those haptic qualities, like the touch and feel and the smell of a book. No, that's a different experience, and we long for that. Sometimes the simulation of something just doesn't take the place of being in the presence of the real thing, to be able to actually touch something. And many of us are experiencing the downfalls of that thinking of always dealing with simulations, like the simulation you're experiencing right now, instead of seeing me in person.
Yes, the behind the scenes setup of our Colgate room right now is quite complex. So we're giving you the polished end for all of you at home. But behind the scenes, there are a lot of cables running around. It's definitely not the analog press that you were working on earlier or yesterday. Speaking of presses, we have a couple questions about your own presses. As you know, and we saw in the video, presses are enormous. So we were wondering what kinds of presses you have available to you, and what your studio has in it at.
Oh yes, my studio has a Vandercook SP15. It's a proof press that was built in the 1960s, so it's very modern, and it's fast, and I really enjoy working on it. And there are a lot of private press printers who use that press as their primary press. I also have a foil stamping press, a quick print press, and I have bookbinding press, and I have some small presses too that I use to when I go on the road with my show, and things like I have a little Chicago Sigwalt and Kelsey press that I lock up small forms in to show people. And sometimes it's easier to illustrate exactly how I make my books with the small press, rather than try to describe the process of printing on the larger presses. But there's a kinship there, and that I really enjoy. And so I like working with those presses. And at the university where I teach, of course, we have some wonderful platen presses there. We have some Reliance, an old Reliance press that is would at one time belonged to Franklin Carmichael, and I believe Carmichael has a relationship to this university too. And we also have some number 4 Vandercook proof presses, and some litho presses and intaglio presses, and facilities for screen printing.
That's a long list.
It's a long list, so I'm very lucky. And also I have many friends who have presses too. And that's
Yes.
the wonderful thing about printing, is it creates community. And then we get to share our knowledge and our equipment with our friends.
Absolutely. It's one of the best things, is that it is a collaborative thing, and you can share resources and knowledge, and like you have with us over the last couple of days. I'm going to have a close-up shot here of your 2 editions go up on screen shortly, because I'd like to know more about it. You mentioned these beautiful enclosures that you have on the table in front of you are the end product of the limited editions. And we're going to have 2 side by side here that everyone can now see. Can you tell us a little bit more about these 2 editions?
Which 2?
It's these 2. There's 2 editions of the Mary Pickford.
Yes.
So you have the finished enclosure in front of you.
Yes.
And I have the other 2.
Yes, and so they're my trials. So I often will be taking the printed sheets that I've finished printing. I take several copies and I'll sew them differently, and I'll try to work out the best way to encase them by testing materials that I might want to use, like handmade paper. Like that particular volume that you see right now is a quarter-bound leather with handmade paper covered beveled boards. The paper was made right here in Montreal at the Saint Armand mill, and a very a favorite paper of mine. And I tested that out on this volume too, and created just this single copy. So it's not like any of the other copies in the edition. And that's kind of fun too, is that to take your edition and then bind them uniquely. And I've done that with several projects that I've been embarked on, is I've actually taken unbound copies and lent them, or I've given them as gifts to friends who are bookbinders, like Don Taylor. He's done some fabulous bindings on my books, and he's a very talented bookbinder, and he creates his own interpretation of what he thinks should be housing these works, and so it's fun to do that. This is your copy. That's the and then there's this copy here, which that one is the final edition, and it's the one that has the drawer with all the treasure in it, and this is the copy that belongs right here in the rare book room at McGill Library. So if you are interested in touching the real thing, I highly encourage you to do that, because it is a different experience from even looking at the popular edition of a book. To actually feel the paper, you can feel the impression that I put on the paper. You can explore the drawer with some of the artifacts that I've enclosed there that are from Mary Pickford's lifetime, and actually do a bit of time travel and find out about the age of silent film, which of course at one time was a popular medium of entertainment, also known as the flickers.
The book is just beautiful. So I do encourage anyone who's, once again, interested in coming to see this in person. We are open for university business, and you can book an appointment with Rare Books if you want to consult things in the collections. We encourage you to do that. You can email us to book an appointment. More questions for George. One question comes in from the crowd, asking about the printing process, asking whether this is lithographic printing that we saw yesterday or not.
No, it's not lithographic printing. Lithographic printing is done from lithostones or lithoplates, and uses a press that looks entirely different. It often has a scraper bar, and the tympan is in most contemporary shops is of a plastic or a steel or an old lithoplate, and the stones are printed directly. And of course, lithography is a chemical process where you have water-loving areas and grease-attracting areas, and so you don't actually have a change in the surface of the stone per se, like you do in relief printing, where you have a raised surface and a lower surface. And when you roll the ink over it, the ink only adheres to the raised surface. In lithography, you have a surface that is damp, that repels ink, and a surface that attracts ink because of the way it has been sensitized on the stone. And this is unique to the Bavarian limestone that is often used in the production of lithographs. Of course, this whole process was developed by Otto Zinenfelder, the German, who was looking for a new way to reproduce music so they could handwrite directly on the stone. And so you may have heard of offset lithography, and that again is a different process because an impression is taken off the stone, it offsets onto a blanket and then onto a piece of paper. So it's an entirely different technology, but it certainly is still a graphic technology. And there's no reason why a person can't create unique limited edition books using lithography. And there are many litho hand presses that you can get to actually achieve those goals. So it's not something we have here at the lab at McGill. They do have the print shop at the Ontario College of Art and Design University has some litho presses that can do that process. But there's no shortage of lithographers in town doing commercial lithography. And if you look hard enough, you'll probably find some printmakers out there too doing stone lithography. And close to here is in Gananoque is of course Otis Tamasauskas, who is a master lithographer, and his works you can find too. And if he used to teach at Queen's University, he's since retired.
So I'm going to put one more detail up on the document camera, and I think this will be our last question. A brief answer just to give everyone a close-up view of what you printed in the video. We have 3 proofs here. Do you want to tell us a little bit just about the differences between the 3 first pulls that we took off the press yesterday?
Now, just to be clear, I can't see them that well because I wear glasses, but I'm going to do this from memory. I think that the first impression, we discovered that the type was over inked. And so we wanted to reduce the amount of ink on that type so that it looked like it was getting a little bit blotchy. And so we wanted to change that. And then the second impression, I adjusted that. And then we noticed that the margins weren't right and that we need to adjust the image on the page. So that meant either moving the form or moving the paper. And in this case, I think we decided to move the form just slightly. I think it was only a pica off. And so the third one, we started to say, well, that's pretty close and it looks pretty good. We've got the inking even on the type and on the engravings. It was fun to make too. It's that's important, is that if you're not having fun doing this, then don't do it.
I think your blacks defy the screens here.
Look at that. This is, unfortunately, ladies and gentlemen, this print is unreproducible. It cannot be seen using digital technology. It can only be experienced in person.
The perfect cover for our document camera.
And touch the work and feel what it's like to have paper in your hands.
Thank you so much. I'm going to pass the microphone now for a final thank you and close to Natalie Cook.
Hello, everyone. I'm the Associate Dean of ROAAR, and I'm just so excited by this event. What a treat to actually have a visitor in our space, you know, talking about the importance of creativity and tactile experiences. So it's tremendous, because I think a year ago we might not have even imagined we were able to do this. So thank you very much, George, for venturing to Montreal and spending some time with us. Thanks to the Book Arts Lab team. So that's Anne-Marie Holland, who interviewed him today, Jennifer Garland, who introduced him, and Lauren Williams, who you saw as the capable assistant with the printing press itself. Thanks also to the ROAAR team who make these events run smoothly. You may not have noticed, we had a lot of moving parts today, not just in the printing press, but we were using a lot of different technology. And this is the first time we've done a hybrid event. And it's really it's a challenge to learn how to do these hybrid events and to be able to coordinate the on-site discussion and also the technology. So thank you very much to Labiba Faiza and to Jacquelyn Sundberg, who you met. These events are possible because of the support of donors and funding from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, and also to our very special private sponsors, Ron Harvey and Doug Bagley. Now you can actually take home your own version of the Columbian. We have printed a pop-up book called A to Z, a McGill experience. And fittingly, you're maybe not going to be able to see it quite, but P is a pop-up of the printing press. And so you can actually see it in action in this remarkable book that was made by paper engineers. Copies are available on the 4th floor with rare books and special collections. And you can actually just purchase one by phoning us and giving us a credit card, and we'll pop it in the mail. Our next event is another printing event. It's going to be on December the 8th, and it's going to be called Printing and Thinking, a conversation with Andrew Steeves and Lauren Williams. So thanks for coming, and please do sign up. We look forward to having you at our next printing event. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.